Sig on it.
Casey, what's up, pal?
Did you get the news on the destination here this morning?
Sig Hansen built his life on risk. Freezing waves, steel decks, decisions made in seconds, with lives on the line. For nearly 2 decades, millions watched him captain chaos on Deadliest Catch, believing they were seeing the raw truth of the world's most dangerous job. But long before the show's future became uncertain, something behind the scenes began to fracture. Seasons felt different. Tension replaced grit. Silence replaced answers. Fans blamed ratings. Networks blamed costs. But Sig now admits that explanation barely scratches the surface. At 59, he's finally acknowledging what the cameras couldn't capture, and the network wouldn't say out loud. The real reason Deadliest Catch was cancelled, or quietly pulled back, wasn't about entertainment at all. It was about pressure, liability, and a line that was crossed too many times to ignore. From the moment Deadliest Catch premiered, it didn't just document fishing, it redefined reality television. Viewers weren't watching contestants chase prize money. They were watching men gamble with their lives in freezing seas where mistakes could kill. At the center stood Sig Hansen, calm under pressure, a captain who seemed built for chaos. The show exploded in popularity, turning working fishermen into household names and the Bering Sea into prime-time drama. With that success came expectations. Networks wanted bigger moments. Audiences wanted higher stakes. And slowly, the line between documenting danger and manufacturing tension began to blur. What started as a window into a brutal profession became a machine that needed constant fuel. Longer seasons, tighter schedules, cameras everywhere. Sig wasn't just captaining a boat anymore. He was anchoring a franchise. Fame followed him off the deck and into every decision he made. Every argument, every close call, every storm became content. The pressure to deliver never fully stopped, even when boats docked. Crews felt it. Captains felt it. The work itself didn't change, but the context did. Fishing had always been dangerous. Now, it was also performative. Moments that once passed quietly were framed as climactic. Conflicts that might have resolved naturally were stretched out by production timelines. And while the audience saw adrenaline, those living it felt fatigue, physical, mental, and emotional. Sig later admitted that the success of the show locked them into a pace that was never meant to last. The industry rewarded escalation, not sustainability. As seasons stacked up, the question quietly shifted from, "Can we do this?" to, "How long can we keep doing this?" And that question didn't have a comfortable answer, because the very thing that made the show iconic, real danger, was becoming harder to justify, harder to ensure, and harder to survive year after year. As the years went on, something subtle but dangerous changed. The cameras didn't just observe reality anymore, they influenced it. Sig Hansen later admitted that the pressure to deliver compelling television began to bleed into real-life decisions on the water. Fishing is already unforgiving, but filming introduced a new layer of expectation that never fully shut off. Producers needed storylines, episodes needed arcs. Close calls became tentpoles. Conflicts were revisited instead of resolved. What viewers saw as raw intensity often came from moments that, in a normal season, would have been handled quietly and moved past. Crew members felt watched constantly, not just for safety, but for content. Captains felt torn between instinct and optics. The job demanded focus, but the show demanded access. Over time, that imbalance grew harder to manage. Sig has since acknowledged that the fishermen slowly lost control of how their lives were portrayed. Editing condensed weeks of stress into minutes of chaos, exaggerating tensions that never fully represented the full picture. A single argument could define an entire season. A bad moment could eclipse decades of experience, and once that version of reality aired, it became permanent. What made this especially dangerous was that viewers assumed everything they saw was necessary, even inevitable. But behind the scenes, exhaustion was building. Long hours, shorter rest, little room to reset between seasons. The sea never became safer, but the margin for error shrank. Decisions made under pressure were now decisions made under scrutiny. Sig later hinted that there were moments when the show's demands pushed too close to a line no one wanted to name. Fishing had always been about survival, not spectacle. And yet, spectacle had become part of the job description. The more successful the series became, the harder it was to slow down without disappointing the machine that had grown around it. What started as documentation was drifting toward obligation. And when obligation meets danger, something eventually breaks. The danger never stayed on the water. What the audience didn't fully see was how the physical and mental toll accumulated season after season. Sig Hansen has spoken about the exhaustion that came from living in a constant state of alert. Not just as a captain responsible for lives, but as a central figure in a show that never truly paused. Fishing seasons were brutal enough on their own. Sleep deprivation, freezing conditions, injuries treated as inconveniences rather than warnings. Add cameras, production schedules, and the pressure of continuity, and the strain multiplied. Bodies broke down faster. Minor injuries lingered. Stress followed crews back to shore, where there was supposed to be relief. Instead, there were interviews, planning meetings, expectations for the next season. Sig later acknowledged that the job stopped being cyclical and became constant. There was no real off switch. The mental burden was just as heavy. Every decision carried double weight. What was safest versus what would be questioned later on screen. Leadership under those conditions took a toll that didn't show up in highlight reels. Tempers shortened. Patience thinned. The responsibility of knowing that one mistake could mean death was always there. But now it existed alongside the awareness that those moments would be replayed, analyzed, and judged by millions. Over time, the human cost became harder to ignore. Some crew members suffered long-term health issues. Others simply couldn't keep up with the pace anymore. Sig has hinted that there were conversations behind the scenes about how much more the cast could realistically endure. The show thrived on danger, but danger isn't infinite when it's lived year after year. The physical decline, the mental fatigue, and the normalization of risk all began to intersect. And once they did, the question stopped being whether the show was successful. It became whether continuing it was responsible at all. When the conversations shifted from ratings to responsibility, everything became more complicated. What the public never fully understood was how many shadows followed the success of Deadliest Catch. Fame brought scrutiny, and scrutiny never stays neatly contained. Legal issues, personal controversies, and public backlash began to overlap with production concerns, creating a situation no one could openly address on screen. Sig Hansen later acknowledged that the pressure of constant visibility magnified every problem, turning private struggles into public risks. Decisions that once belonged to captains and crews were now filtered through lawyers, insurers, and network executives. Trust eroded quietly. Fishermen questioned whether the show still represented their reality or simply needed their reality to keep escalating. The network, meanwhile, faced growing liability. Every injury, every near miss, every medical emergency raised questions no amount of editing could soften. Insurance costs climbed, legal exposure widened, and the human element became impossible to ignore. These weren't actors playing danger. They were real people aging, wearing down, and carrying the consequences of years spent in extreme conditions. Sig has hinted that there were moments when continuing felt less like opportunity and more like obligation, a machine that no one could easily step away from without consequences. Silence became a strategy. Not everything could be explained publicly without risking reputations, contracts, or futures. So explanations stayed vague. Fans sensed something was wrong, but the truth stayed buried beneath official statements and careful phrasing. What made this phase so unsettling was how quickly admiration could turn into judgment. The same exposure that built careers also intensified criticism, leaving little room for nuance. The cast found themselves trapped between loyalty to the show that made them famous and the reality that the cost was growing heavier each year. And as these pressures piled up, it became clear that the show wasn't just documenting danger anymore. It was surrounded by it from every angle. By the time the network began pulling back, the reasons had little to do with audience loyalty and everything to do with exposure. The danger that once made the show compelling had become a liability that could no longer be justified. Each season carried higher insurance premiums, stricter safety demands, and mounting legal oversight. What had started as documentation of a dangerous profession was now a long-running production built around risk that couldn't be mitigated without changing the show itself. Executives quietly questioned how many more seasons could be filmed before something irreversible happened on camera. The calculus was brutal. If nothing went wrong, the show survived another year. If something did, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just morally, but financially and legally. Behind closed doors, the tone shifted from expansion to containment. Fewer guarantees, shorter commitments, more conditions placed on production. Sig Hansen later suggested that the network wasn't worried about popularity. They were worried about responsibility. The crews were aging. The captains were carrying decades of accumulated strain. The margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. And unlike scripted television, there was no safety net when reality turned deadly. Continuing to film meant accepting a level of risk that could no longer be defended as entertainment. The network didn't announce a clean ending because there wasn't one. Instead, the show was slowly scaled back, its future left intentionally vague. That uncertainty wasn't creative, it was legal. Every delay bought time to reassess whether the cost of continuing outweighed the benefit. Fans speculated about ratings and storylines, but the real discussions were happening in boardrooms and legal offices. Could the show survive another accident? Another lawsuit? Another season of pushing men past their limits? Sig has implied that by the end, everyone involved understood the same thing, even if no one said it publicly. The danger that once defined the show had become too real to keep packaging as entertainment. When the music slowed and the phones stopped ringing, the real consequences began to surface. Careers can be rebuilt, but public judgment leaves marks that don't fade with time. For many of these women, the backlash didn't end when headlines moved on. It followed them into every part of life. Trust became harder. Relationships felt riskier. Even stepping outside invited scrutiny they never asked for. Some spoke quietly about anxiety that lingered long after tours ended, about second-guessing every decision because they had learned how quickly approval could turn into punishment. Others chose isolation, shrinking their worlds to protect what remained of their peace. The irony was painful. The same industry that demanded authenticity had taught them to hide. They became experts at privacy, Not because they wanted secrecy, but because openness had proven dangerous. A few women found new purpose away from the spotlight, writing for others, mentoring younger artists, building lives that didn't depend on applause. But even then, the past lingered. Introductions still carried footnotes. Achievements were still framed through old narratives. Some artists admitted they stopped talking about love entirely, unwilling to give the public anything else to judge. What hurt most was the sense of disposability. Years of dedication, success, and influence reduced to a single storyline they never controlled. Fans often assumed these women fell off or lost relevance, never seeing how deliberately they were pushed aside. And inside Nashville, their stories became cautionary examples, unspoken reminders of what happens when expectations are broken. Younger artists listened closely. They learned to guard their personal lives, to separate the woman from the brand, to choose silence over honesty if forced to pick. The cycle continued quietly, reinforced by fear rather than rules. These women paid a price, not just with their careers, but with their confidence, their trust, and their sense of safety in a world that once promised them everything. And while some eventually found stability again, the cost of that stability was clear. They had to live smaller, quieter, and far more carefully than the men who made the same choices without consequence. What fans never fully understood was how much of the story stayed off camera by design. Sig Hansen has since suggested that many of the most dangerous moments were never meant to be broadcast, not because they weren't dramatic, but because they raised questions no one wanted to answer. Medical emergencies handled quietly. Calls made that didn't fit an episode arc. Decisions to turn back that looked like weakness on screen but were survival in reality. Over time, the gap between what was lived and what was shown widened. Editing protected the audience from the full weight of responsibility, and in doing so, protected the network from scrutiny. Deadliest Catch thrived on authenticity, but authenticity has limits when lives are involved. The show trained viewers to expect escalation, yet the people living it knew escalation wasn't always an option. Some risks were calculated, others were unavoidable, and a few, Sig has implied, were simply too much to justify repeating year after year. The audience saw toughness. They didn't see hesitation. They saw confidence. They didn't see the second-guessing that followed every close call. Reality television flattened complexity into spectacle, and that flattening came at a human cost. Captains carried the weight of knowing that their decisions would be replayed, dissected, and judged by people who never felt the cold or the exhaustion. That awareness changed behavior. It added pressure where none was needed. Sig has acknowledged that the show blurred lines between documenting danger and normalizing it, between courage and expectation. Fans believed they were watching a job as it truly was, but the truth is, they were watching a version shaped to be survivable for television. The most dangerous thing wasn't the storms or the decks. It was the idea that this level of risk could be repeated indefinitely without consequence. And when that idea finally collapsed, the silence around it became telling. The show didn't need a dramatic ending to reveal the truth. The truth was in what stopped being shown, in the questions that were never answered, and in the growing sense that continuing would mean crossing a line no one could defend anymore. Sig Hansen no longer talks about Deadliest Catch as a triumph. He talks about it as endurance. At 59, with decades of seasons behind him and fewer ahead, his reflections carry a weight that didn't exist when the cameras first boarded his boat. What began as a way to document a dangerous job became something far larger than anyone anticipated. a machine that fed on risk, pressure, and the willingness of real people to keep pushing themselves past reasonable limits. Sig has admitted that for a long time, he convinced himself the cost was worth it. The exposure brought money, opportunity, and a platform for a profession that had always lived in the shadows. But slowly, that justification eroded. The job never became safer. The men didn't become younger, and the responsibility didn't get lighter. Every season added another layer of stress, another set of decisions made under impossible conditions, another year of carrying the knowledge that one mistake, one moment caught on camera, could end lives and redefine everything forever. What fans saw as courage often felt like obligation. What looked like toughness often hid exhaustion. Sig has acknowledged that the show normalized danger in a way that even those living it began to accept, without question. That normalization was the most unsettling part. When risk becomes routine, it stops being evaluated honestly. And when entertainment depends on that risk, it creates a pressure that no amount of experience can fully manage. Ending the show wasn't about defeat. It was about acknowledging reality. The reality that documenting danger year after year doesn't make it sustainable. The reality that responsibility doesn't disappear just because viewers tune in. Sig has hinted that walking away, or allowing the show to fade rather than end explosively, was the only way to regain control of a life that had been shaped by expectation for too long. The silence around the show's future wasn't a failure of transparency. It was an admission that there was no clean explanation that wouldn't expose uncomfortable truths. The truth that reality television can push real people further than they would ever push themselves alone. The truth that some stories don't need to continue to be meaningful. And the truth that survival sometimes means stopping. Looking back, Sig doesn't deny the impact of Deadliest Catch. He understands what it meant to viewers and what it gave to those involved. But he also understands what it took. Years of strain, bodies worn down, mental fatigue masked as resilience. A line slowly approaching that could not be crossed without consequence. In that context, the end of the show is no longer shocking. It's inevitable. Not because the danger went away, but because it finally became impossible to justify filming it as entertainment. Sig Hansen didn't reveal this truth for attention. He revealed it because time stripped away the need to perform. What remains is a man who spent his life managing risk, finally admitting that the greatest risk was pretending it could go on forever.